The fire had not even touched the fabric yet, and already my hands were shaking. I stood in the third row of the observation platform, pressed between two Velmari officers who smelled like burnt copper, watching the Emperor raise his hand toward the golden brazier at the center of the hall. Every camera drone in the chamber turned toward him at once, 100 small red lights blinking in perfect unison, ready to send this moment to every corner of the empire he ruled. On the pedestal in front of him lay Earth's flag, our flag, the one Commander Grace Whitfield had carried onto this station 11 days ago, as a gesture of goodwill, folded neat and proper, the way you fold something you still believe means something. The Emperor's name was Vantor Ashikel Dren, the ninth of his line, and he had not looked directly at a human since we arrived. He looked at it now. His eyes, 3 shades of violet layered over each other like oil on water, moved slowly across the fabric, as if reading an insult written in a language only he understood. "Let the lesser world see," he said, and his voice carried through the hall without him raising it, because the hall was built to carry a voice like his. "Let them see what becomes of those who believe they stand equal to the throne." I wanted to step forward. Every instinct told me to step forward, to say something, anything, even if it accomplished nothing but getting me removed from the chamber. But Nathan Cole gripped my wrist before I could move. He didn't look at me. He just held on, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the flag. "Not yet," he whispered. "Watch." I didn't understand what he meant. Not then. The Emperor lowered his hand. A thin beam of ceremonial fire, more for show than heat, licked up from the brazier and touched the corner of the flag. The fabric curled. Smoke rose in a lazy spiral toward the vaulted ceiling, catching the light from 1,000 small chandeliers made of captured stars, or so the Velmari claimed. I had never believed that story. I believed it a little more in that moment, watching my country's colors turn to ash under lights that weren't supposed to exist. Somewhere behind me, one of the alien dignitaries let out a low, satisfied hum. Somewhere else, a human aide I didn't know pressed her hand over her mouth. I felt something break inside my chest, quiet and total, like a bone snapping under skin that never bruises. And then every screen in the chamber went black. Not flickered, not dimmed, black, all at once, as if someone had reached into the light itself and pulled the plug on the universe. The broadcast drones dropped from the air, their red lights dying mid-blink. The enormous display behind the throne, the one that had been playing the Emperor's own face in 6-story detail moments before, turned into a dark mirror that showed nothing but his own reflection staring back at him, confused, for the first time since I had met him, uncertain. A murmur rolled through the hall, low and spreading, the kind of sound a crowd makes right before it becomes something else. I heard chairs scrape. I heard someone say a word in Velmari that I didn't know but understood anyway, because fear sounds the same in every language. The Emperor turned toward his technicians, a cluster of pale, nervous creatures in silver robes who worked the control terraces along the eastern wall. They were already moving, hands flying over panels that, for the first time in living memory, did not answer them. "Fix it," the Emperor said, and his voice had lost the effortless calm from a moment before. "Fix it now." One of the technicians looked up, his throat working like he was trying to swallow something too large. "Your Grace, we cannot. There is nothing to fix, there is no signal, there is no power draw. It is as if the network itself has simply stopped listening to us." I felt Nathan's grip on my wrist tighten again, and this time I understood why. He wasn't afraid. He was relieved. I looked at him, and for one strange, suspended second, I saw something in his face I hadn't seen since we boarded this station 11 days ago. Not fear, not defiance either. Something quieter and heavier than both. Recognition, like a man watching a storm arrive, that he had been waiting for his whole life. And finally, it had come. "Nathan," I said, barely above a breath. "What did you do?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes were on the dead screen behind the throne, on the Emperor's own reflection staring back at him from glass that used to show his face to 100 billion souls across 1,000 worlds. "I didn't do anything," Nathan said quietly. "We did. A long time ago. We just never told them what we built." The chamber had turned into chaos by then, aides and officers rushing between terraces, voices rising over each other in 6 different languages, none of them getting anywhere. Guards moved to seal the doors, more out of habit than any real plan, because sealing a door does nothing when the thing that's broken isn't a door at all. I looked past the panic, past the golden brazier where the last corner of our flag curled into ash, and I looked at the Emperor. He was standing very still, hands at his sides, staring at the dark screen like a man who had just realized the floor beneath him was not as solid as he believed. For 11 days I had watched this man speak and every world in his empire listened. I had watched cities go silent when his image appeared, watched entire fleets change course on a single word from his mouth. Power like that does something to a person. It convinces them the universe itself answers to their voice. But the universe wasn't answering him now. And somewhere in that silence, I understood something I would spend the rest of my life trying to properly explain. We had not come to this station as guests, or as prisoners, or even as a nation begging for a seat at someone else's table. We had come as the people who quietly held the whole table together, and nobody had ever thought to ask us what would happen if we simply let go. A young officer near the Emperor's dais dropped to one knee, his voice cracking as he reported something into a device that no longer worked. He kept talking anyway, out of habit, out of fear, saying words into a silence that swallowed them whole. I turned to look at the ashes of our flag one more time. Smoke still rose from the brazier in a thin, dying thread, curling upward into a hall built for gods, watched by lights that no longer worked, in an empire that had just discovered, all at once, exactly how much it depended on the people it had spent so long looking down on. Nathan finally let go of my wrist. His hand was trembling slightly, though his voice, when he spoke again, was steady. "They burned a flag," he said, thinking it was just a piece of cloth. I looked at him, and for the first time since the fire started, I felt something other than grief rising in my chest. "It was never just cloth," I said. Around us, the Empire's greatest chamber sat in total darkness, its screens dead, its drones grounded, its Emperor staring at his own reflection with no idea, not yet, of exactly how far this silence was going to reach. I didn't know all of it either, not in that moment, but I knew enough to understand that something had just begun that none of them could stop, and none of them had seen coming, because they had never once thought to look at the people quietly running their world. The guards near the doors were shouting now, trying to restore some kind of order, but their voices only added to the confusion, bouncing off walls that no longer lit up to guide anyone anywhere. Somewhere in the crowd, I heard someone weeping, whether from fear or fury I couldn't tell. Somewhere else, a Velmari elder muttered a prayer I didn't recognize, his eyes fixed on the dead screen, as if it might blink back to life if he simply asked politely enough. It didn't. The technicians at the control terrace had given up trying to explain the failure, and were now simply staring at their own hands, at panels gone silent under their fingers, at a network that had obeyed them without question for longer than most of their families had existed. I looked at Grace Whitfield across the chamber, still holding herself with the same composure she'd carried since the moment we arrived, though I could see now that her eyes were bright, and her chin trembled just slightly before she steadied it. She caught my gaze and gave the smallest nod, as if to say, "Hold on, just a little longer, we are not finished yet." The Emperor turned from the dead screen at last, and when he faced the room, something in his posture had changed. He still stood tall, still wore the weight of 9 generations of rule across his shoulders, but his eyes moved differently now, searching the crowd, searching for someone to blame, someone to question, someone who might explain what his own empire could not. His gaze landed on us. On the small cluster of humans standing quietly near the edge of the platform, the only people in the entire chamber who were not moving, not panicking, not shouting orders into dead machines. I felt the weight of his attention settle over me like a hand closing around my throat, gentle at first, and then not gentle at all. "You," he said, and though the hall no longer carried his voice through hidden speakers, it still reached every corner, because every single person in that chamber had gone quiet enough to hear a pin drop. "What do you know of this?" I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch, let it grow heavier, let him feel exactly how much power there was in simply choosing not to speak. Nathan stepped half a pace forward beside me, calm in a way that unsettled even me, and when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, quiet, and utterly without fear. "Your Grace," he said, "perhaps it's time we talked about who really built the network you've been standing on." The Emperor's violet eyes narrowed, and behind him, on a screen with no light left inside it, I could see nothing but darkness staring back at all of us, patient, total, and only just beginning. Somewhere far above the station, in relay towers scattered across 1,000 systems, in cables laid by human hands decades ago, and trusted by no one who ever asked what those hands had truly built, something ancient and quiet had finally woken up, and it was listening to every word being spoken in that chamber, waiting to see what the Empire would do next. I had come to this station believing we were guests in someone else's house. I was beginning to understand we had built the house ourselves, brick by brick, wire by wire, and simply never told our host where the walls were load-bearing, The ash from our flag settled slowly onto the golden floor of the throne room, and above it, in a darkness of the Empire's own making, our answer was already being written. The silence in the chamber did not stay silent for long. Within minutes, runners were sent through every corridor of the station, since the internal messaging system had gone dark along with everything else. I watched Velmari officers sprint past carrying handwritten notes, an act so foreign to them that some of them held the paper like it might bite. In an empire built on instant communication across 1,000 worlds, nobody remembered how to send a message the slow way anymore. I used the confusion to pull Nathan Cole aside, into an alcove behind one of the massive support columns where the shadows were thick enough to hide a quiet conversation. "Tell me everything," I said. "Now, before they think to separate us." Nathan glanced over his shoulder once, checking that no one stood close enough to hear, then let out a slow breath, like a man setting down a weight he had been carrying for years. "You know the relay network," he said, "the one that connects every system in the Empire, communications, navigation beacons, trade ledgers, even parts of their environmental controls on the older stations. You know who built most of it." I did know. Everyone who worked in diplomatic circles knew, though it was rarely spoken about directly, because it wasn't considered important enough to discuss. Decades ago, when the Empire expanded faster than its own engineers could manage, it looked for cheap, reliable labor to build the unglamorous backbone of its infrastructure, not the elegant flagships, not the palaces or the ceremonial halls, the wiring underneath all of it, the relay stations, the signal towers, the endless grinding maintenance work that kept the whole system breathing. Humanity took that contract eagerly, back when we were still desperate for any kind of standing among the stars, back when being useful felt like the only door open to us. Thousands of our engineers spent years crawling through cold access tunnels and orbital scaffolding, building something the Empire barely thought about once it was finished, the way you don't think about the water pipes in your walls until they stop working. "We built it," Nathan continued. "All of it. Every relay station, every signal tower, every piece of the network that lets a message travel from one end of this empire to the other, in less time than it takes to blink. And when we were finished, they thanked us the way you thank someone you plan to forget. No credit in their histories, no mention in their ceremonies. Just a name on an old contract nobody bothered to read twice. So the network," I said slowly, "still answers to us." Nathan's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "It always did, we just never told them that." I felt a chill move through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the station. "How is that even possible?" I said. "Surely they've audited it, replaced the original systems by now. An empire this size doesn't run critical infrastructure on decades-old human code without checking it." "They tried, early on," Nathan said, "but maintaining it required understanding it, and understanding it required doing the kind of tedious, unglamorous work that no one in this empire considers worth their time. So they kept renewing our contracts instead. Generation after generation, human engineers went back into those same tunnels, updated the same systems, patched the same relays, and every single time, we left a little more of ourselves inside the architecture. Fail-safes, overrides, small things buried so deep that nobody without our specific knowledge would ever find them, let alone understand what they did." "A dead man's switch," I said. "Something like that," Nathan said. "Except it isn't triggered by anyone dying, it's triggered by something else. Something we built in decades ago, when the first generation of engineers realized exactly how little the Empire valued the people doing this work, and how much power they were quietly handing us in exchange for their comfort." I stared at him, my mind racing to catch up with what he was describing. "What triggers it, Nathan?" He looked past me, out toward the chamber, where the Emperor still stood near his darkened dais, surrounded by advisors who had no answers for him. "A significant, deliberate act meant to humiliate Earth or its recognized representatives," Nathan said quietly. "Something calculated, broadcast across the Empire, meant to show every other species exactly what happens to those who challenge the throne." The pieces fell together in my mind with a kind of terrible clarity. "The flag," I said. Nathan nodded slowly. "The flag." I felt the weight of it settle over me, heavier than anything I had carried since stepping onto this station. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't some clever plan cooked up in secret over the last 11 days. This was something built decades ago, patient and quiet, waiting in the deepest layers of the Empire's own infrastructure for exactly this moment, for exactly this kind of insult, delivered exactly this publicly. "How long have you known?" I asked. "I've known the shape of it my whole career," Nathan said. "My grandmother helped write some of the original code. She used to tell me stories when I was young, about crawling through freezing access shafts on some forgotten station, patching systems that an entire empire depended on. while the officers walking past didn't even bother learning her name. She said the day would come when someone in power would forget how much they needed us, and when that day came, the Empire would finally understand what it built its own house out of. She knew this would happen. She hoped it would never need to, Nathan said, but she made sure it could, just in case. Across the chamber, a group of Velmari engineers had gathered near one of the dead control terraces, arguing loudly over a panel that refused to respond no matter how many override codes they tried. One of them slammed his palm against the surface in frustration, and I watched the gesture with a strange, quiet satisfaction I wasn't proud of but couldn't quite suppress either. They're going to figure out it was us eventually, I said. And when they do, they're not going to be gentle about asking why. Let them ask, Nathan said. We're not hiding it. We were never planning to hide it. The whole point of building something like this was never to strike in secret and disappear. It was to make sure that if this moment ever came, the Empire would have no choice but to finally sit across the table from us as equals, instead of servants they occasionally invited to a ceremony. I thought about Grace Whitfield's small, steady nod earlier, the way she hadn't so much as flinched when the fire touched our flag. I thought about the calm on the faces of the other human aides scattered around the chamber, none of them shouting, none of them running toward the exits like everyone else. How many of us knew? I asked. How many of us came to this station already knowing exactly what would happen if they did something like this? Nathan's expression softened slightly, and for the first time since the fire started, I saw something almost gentle in his eyes. Not many, he said. A handful of us, chosen carefully, sent here specifically because we understood the failsafe and could recognize the signs if the Empire pushed too far. The rest of our delegation came here in good faith, hoping for nothing more than a peaceful conversation. We didn't come here planning to use this. We came here hoping we'd never have to. But they gave you no choice. They gave themselves no choice, Nathan said. We offered them a hand, they chose to burn it instead. The chamber around us had grown louder, more chaotic, as officers and engineers realized that whatever runners they sent through the station were only confirming what the dead screens already told them. Every relay across the Empire had gone silent at exactly the same moment. Not a malfunction confined to this station, not a localized failure that could be patched from a nearby terminal. Something vast, something deliberate, something reaching into every corner of the Empire's nervous system and simply switching it off. I looked toward the Emperor again, watching him pace in front of his darkened throne, his advisors trailing behind him with nothing useful to offer. For the first time since I had met him, he looked less like a ruler and more like a man discovering, in real time, exactly how much smaller his kingdom had suddenly become. What happens now? I asked Nathan. If they figure out how deep this goes, if they realize just how much of their empire depends on systems we quietly maintain, what's stopping them from turning that fear into something worse? What's stopping them from deciding the safest path is to remove every human from every station across their territory before we can use this leverage again? Nathan's jaw tightened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of real concern cross his face. That's exactly the risk, he said. Which is why what happens in the next few hours matters more than anything either of us has done up until this point. If we handle this the wrong way, if we look like we're gloating, if we make them feel cornered instead of simply reminded, they might decide that the only way to feel safe again is to burn every bridge we've built, including us. And if we handle it right. Nathan looked past me one more time, toward the Emperor's tense, uncertain silhouette against the backdrop of dead screens. If we handle it right, he said, they finally understand exactly what kind of partner they've been ignoring for generations. And maybe, for the first time since we entered this empire, they start treating us like one. Before I could respond, a low, uneven tone rippled through the chamber, and every head turned at once toward the enormous screen behind the throne. For a moment, nothing happened, just a faint hum building somewhere deep inside the dead glass. Then, slowly, a single point of light appeared at its center, small and steady, growing brighter with every passing second. The advisors around the Emperor went utterly silent. The engineers at the control terraces froze mid-argument, staring up at the screen like it might reach down and answer for them. I felt Nathan go very still beside me. That's not supposed to happen yet, he murmured, almost to himself. Someone triggered the next stage early. What next stage? I asked, my pulse picking up. Nathan didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed locked on that single, growing point of light, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I hadn't heard from him before, somewhere between caution and something close to wonder. The message, he said quietly. It's about to speak for us. The light on the screen pulsed once, twice, and then steadied into a shape none of us in that chamber had chosen, waiting to be seen by every world still listening in the dark. The shape on the screen resolved slowly, like something rising through dark water. It was not a face. It was not a symbol of conquest or threat, the kind the Empire's own broadcasts loved to use whenever they wanted to remind a distant world exactly who it answered to. It was simple. A single circle, half in light and half in shadow, with a thin line drawn straight through its center, dividing it evenly in two. I recognized it before anyone else in that chamber could, because I had seen it before, stitched quietly into the corner of old human engineering reports. A symbol nobody outside our own people had ever thought to ask about. It meant balance. It meant an account finally being settled, neither more nor less than what was owed. Beneath the circle, words began to form, first in our language, then in Velmari script, then in a dozen others I didn't recognize, spreading across every screen the network could still reach, translated instantly for every world watching. You built your empire on the hands of those you called beneath you. Today you tried to burn what little respect remained between us. The network you depend on was built by human hands, and it listens to human hands still. This silence will not lift until Earth is acknowledged as an equal partner, not a servant, not a curiosity, not a people to be humiliated on a whim for the comfort of a crowd. We ask for nothing you would not grant any other world under your banner. We ask only that you stop pretending we are less than that. The chamber erupted. Not into shouting, not at first, but into a kind of stunned murmuring that spread from person to person like a current running through still water. I watched Velmari officers turn to look at each other, then at the small cluster of humans still standing quietly near the platform's edge, their expressions shifting from confusion to something colder and sharper. The Emperor read the words twice. I could see his lips move slightly the second time, as if he needed to be certain he hadn't misunderstood. When he finally looked up from the screen, his violet eyes found me first, then Nathan, then swept across the rest of our small delegation standing near the platform. "Bring them to me," he said, and this time there was no performance in his voice at all, no calculated calm meant for an audience. Just a raw, unguarded command from a ruler who had never once in his reign needed to demand an explanation from anyone. 2 guards moved toward us immediately, their weapons still holstered but their hands hovering close, the way people reach for comfort rather than actual intent to act. I let them guide me forward without resistance, because resistance now would only make things harder, and because some small, steady part of me wanted exactly this. I wanted to stand in front of him and answer for what my people had built, not with fear, but with the truth. Nathan walked beside me, calm as ever, though I could feel the tension radiating off him in waves. We stopped a respectful distance from the throne, close enough to see every line of frustration carved into the Emperor's face, far enough that the guards flanking us could still feel useful. Behind him, the screen with the human message continued to glow steadily, patient, unbothered by the chaos it had caused, refusing to fade the way every other light in the chamber had. "Explain this," the Emperor said, his voice low and dangerous in a way I hadn't heard from him before. "Explain to me why my empire, an empire that spans 1,000 systems and has stood for longer than your entire species has walked upright, now depends on the whims of a handful of humans standing in my own throne room." I let the silence stretch just long enough to matter before I answered. "Because you never asked us how deep our work went," I said. "You saw a species willing to do the tedious labor no one else wanted, and you assumed that meant we were simple. You never once considered that the people crawling through your relay towers for 3 generations might understand your empire's own infrastructure better than the officers who never once set foot inside it." A ripple of unease moved through the advisors clustered near the throne. One of them, an older Velmari official with pale gray markings across his cheeks, stepped forward as if to interject, but the Emperor raised a single hand, and the man fell silent immediately. "You are telling me," the Emperor said slowly, "that this network, the very foundation this empire communicates and trades and governs through, can be silenced by your people at will." "I am telling you," I said, "that it always could be. We simply never had a reason to use that power until today." "And what?" the Emperor said, his voice sharpening. "Would you have me believe stops you from using it again? From silencing my empire whenever it suits you? From holding a blade over every world under my banner because a handful of your engineers decided decades ago to hide something inside my own systems?" I thought carefully before answering, because this was the moment that mattered most, the one Nathan had warned me about in the shadow of that support column. This was the moment where fear could either turn into respect or curdle into something far more dangerous. "Nothing stops us," I said honestly. "Nothing, except the same thing that stopped us from using it for decades before today. We don't want to control your empire, Your Grace. We never did. If we wanted control, we would have taken it generations ago. quietly, the way you might expect from a people you assumed were beneath such ambition. What we want is exactly what the message behind you says. Acknowledgement. A seat at the table that isn't handed to us as a favor and taken away the moment it becomes inconvenient. The Emperor's eyes narrowed, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, simply studying me the way you might study an opponent whose strength you had badly underestimated. Before he could respond, one of the officers standing near the edge of the platform stepped forward, breaking protocol in a way that clearly startled everyone around him, including the guards who moved instinctively to intercept him before the Emperor waved them off. "Your Grace," the officer said, and I recognized the sharp edge in his voice immediately, the kind that belonged to someone who had spent his entire career believing in the Empire's absolute strength, and now found that belief cracking beneath him. This is precisely why lesser species should never be trusted with anything beyond the simplest tasks. They have poisoned our own infrastructure and now dare to negotiate as if they hold any true power over us. I say we remove them from this station immediately, all of them, and send a fleet to remind Earth exactly whose empire they live within. A few voices around him murmured in agreement, though I noticed just as many stayed silent, their eyes flicking uncertainly between the officer and the dead screen still hanging dark around the chamber. I felt Nathan tense beside me, and I understood immediately what was at stake. This was the moment Nathan had feared back in the alcove. The moment where fear turned to aggression instead of understanding, where a wounded pride decided that force was the only acceptable answer to embarrassment. "Careful," I said quietly, loud enough only for those closest to hear. "Before you send anything toward Earth, you should understand exactly what you'd be triggering." The officer turned toward me, his expression twisting into something scornful. "Threats now, from a creature who crawls through wires for a living." "Not a threat," I said, keeping my voice leveled despite the heat rising in my chest. "A warning, offered honestly, because I would rather you understand the consequences before you act than discover them afterward." I looked past him, toward the Emperor, and continued. "What you witnessed today was not the full extent of what we built into your network. It was the mildest possible response, triggered by a public act of humiliation against Earth's flag. If any hostile action is taken against our homeworld, or against any human currently serving anywhere within this empire, the systems built into your infrastructure carry a second layer, one designed specifically for that scenario. Not a simple blackout this time. A complete and permanent severing of every relay, every beacon, every navigation system your fleets depend on to move safely between systems. Ships already in transit would be left without guidance in the space between worlds. Trade routes that keep 1,000 systems fed and supplied would collapse overnight. And unlike the blackout you experienced moments ago, this second failsafe was never designed to be reversible. The chamber went utterly silent. Even the officer who had spoken so boldly moments before seemed to shrink slightly, his earlier confidence draining from his face as the weight of what I described settled over him. The Emperor's gaze had not left mine the entire time I spoke, and when I finished, he remained quiet for a long moment, his violet eyes searching my expression for any hint of exaggeration, any flicker of bluff he might exploit. He found none, because there was none to find. "You would destroy an empire of 1,000 worlds," he said slowly, "over a single flag." "No," I said. "We would never choose to do that, Your Grace. And I sincerely hope you never force our hand into proving it. What we would do, what we built this failsafe to do, is simply refuse to continue holding up a house that no longer respects the hands that built it. We are not asking you to fear us. We are asking you to finally see us." The older Velmari official who had tried to speak earlier stepped forward again, more cautiously this time, his voice quieter, more measured. "Your Grace, if what she says is true, then attempting force against Earth risks catastrophic consequences not only for the humans, but for every world under our protection. Perhaps this is not a moment for punishment, but for negotiation." The Emperor's jaw tightened, and I watched something shift behind his eyes, the slow, reluctant recalculation of a ruler, realizing that the shape of the world he governed had just changed permanently, whether he wished it to or not. "And if I refuse to negotiate," he said, turning his attention back to me, "if I decide instead that no empire can afford to be held hostage by the very people it once employed to dig its tunnels and wire its towers, what then?" I held his gaze steadily, refusing to look away, refusing to let even a flicker of doubt cross my face, though my heart pounded hard enough that I was certain everyone near me could hear it. "Then you will discover," I said, "exactly how much of your empire's daily life depends on systems we quietly maintain, and you will discover it all at once, permanently, with no one left willing to fix what breaks. We are not your enemies, Your Grace. We never wanted to be." But we will not stand here and be humiliated as if our contribution to this empire was worth nothing more than a ceremonial fire. The silence that followed stretched longer than any silence I had experienced in that chamber so far, longer even than the moment the screens first went dark. The Emperor studied me, studied Nathan, studied the small, steady cluster of humans still standing near the platform's edge, none of us flinching, none of us backing down. Finally, he turned toward the dead screen behind his throne, toward the message still glowing steadily in a darkness that refused to lift, the circle divided evenly by its single, patient line. "Draft terms," he said quietly, not to me, but to the advisors gathered nervously around him. "I want to hear exactly what this world believes it is owed." The officer who had spoken so aggressively moments before opened his mouth as if to protest, then thought better of it, retreating instead into the crowd with his jaw clenched tight, and his eyes burning with a resentment I suspected would not simply disappear because his emperor had chosen caution over pride. I felt a small, cautious relief loosen the tight knot in my chest, though I knew better than to mistake this moment for safety. We had bought ourselves a conversation, nothing more. Somewhere in that chamber, and somewhere far beyond it across 1,000 worlds still sitting in silence, there were those who would rather see this end in conflict than in compromise. Nathan leaned slightly toward me, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's the easy part done," he murmured. "Now comes the part where we have to make sure they actually mean it." I glanced toward the dead screens still hanging around the chamber, toward the patient circle glowing steadily behind the throne, and toward the uncertain, complicated road that had just opened in front of all of us. "Then let's make sure they do," I said. The negotiation chamber they led us to was smaller than the throne room, quieter, lit by soft lanterns that still worked because they ran on simple chemical light, rather than the Empire's failed network. It felt strange to sit somewhere that didn't depend on the systems we controlled, as if the room itself had been chosen to remind everyone present that not everything in this empire belonged to us. Around the long stone table sat representatives from a dozen different worlds, most of whom I had never spoken to directly during our 11 days on the station. Some wore the silver robes of Velmari nobility, others wore the woven bands of the Karathi trade guilds, or the segmented armor plating favored by the Iskavi military caste. All of them watched our small human delegation with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility, though a few, I noticed, watched us with something closer to quiet respect. Grace Whitfield sat at the center of our side of the table, calm and composed despite everything, with Nathan Cole to her right and myself to her left. Two other members of our delegation, Priya Lang and Edward Finch, sat further down, both of them clearly nervous but doing an admirable job of hiding it. The Emperor did not attend this session personally, which Nathan quietly explained was both a small insult and a small blessing. An insult, because it suggested he still considered this beneath his direct involvement. A blessing, because it meant we could speak more plainly, without the theater that always surrounded him. In his place sat a senior advisor named Corvain Thess, an older Velmari official with calm eyes, and the same gray markings I had noticed on the man who spoke up during our confrontation in the throne room. It took me a moment to realize they were the same person. "Let us speak plainly," Corvain said, folding his long hands together on the table. "Your message stated a demand for acknowledgement as an equal partner rather than a subordinate people. I would like to understand precisely what that means in practical terms, because an empire cannot function on vague sentiment alone." Grace answered first, her voice steady and clear. "It means an end to unilateral treatment of Earth as a resource, to be used and discarded at convenience. It means our engineers, our diplomats, and our citizens serving within this empire receive the same protections and considerations extended to any other recognized member world. It means no more ceremonies designed to humiliate us for the entertainment of a crowd. And in exchange," Corvain said, "you would restore full function to the network." "We would," Grace said, "immediately and completely, once terms are agreed upon and formally recognized before witnesses from multiple worlds, not simply promised quietly and forgotten the moment the crisis passes." A murmur moved around the table, and I noticed several representatives exchanging glances, some clearly surprised that our demands were so measured. I suspected many of them had expected something far more extreme, some grand claim to territory or resources, the kind of demand that would confirm every suspicion the Empire's hardliners already held about lesser species given sudden power. The representative from the Karathi Trade Guild, a sharp-eyed woman named Ilsa Bracken, who I later learned had spent decades negotiating trade disputes across a dozen systems, leaned forward with obvious interest. "You could have asked for far more," she said. "Territory, resources, a formal seat on the ruling council itself. Instead, you ask only for basic respect. Forgive me for saying so, but that seems almost too modest given the leverage you currently hold. I answered this one myself. We're not interested in conquest, and we never were. What we built into your network wasn't meant to be a weapon for gaining power. It was meant to be insurance against exactly what happened today. A public humiliation, designed to remind every world in this empire that we don't matter. We don't want your throne. We want to stop being treated like something beneath consideration. Ilsa studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly, though I couldn't quite read whether it was agreement or simply acknowledgement. The Iskavi representative, a broad-shouldered officer named Dravith Kaur, had remained silent for most of the discussion, his armored fingers tapping slowly against the table. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the clipped, formal cadence of someone accustomed to giving orders, rather than requesting anything. "And what assurance do we have," he said, "that once these terms are granted, your people will not simply use this same leverage again the next time you feel slighted? You have shown us today that an entire empire can be brought to silence by a handful of engineers. That is not a comfortable truth to carry forward, regardless of how modestly you phrase your current demands." This was the question I had been waiting for, the one Nathan had warned me would eventually surface, because fear rarely stays quiet for long once it has been given a reason to exist. "You're right to be uncomfortable," I said, choosing my words carefully. "I won't pretend otherwise. The truth is, the failsafe exists, and it will continue to exist, because removing it entirely would require rebuilding your entire network from scratch, something your empire has shown no willingness to invest in over the past several decades. What I can offer you instead is this. Once terms are formally recognized, we are prepared to work jointly with your engineers, transparently, to review the systems together, so that neither side is left guessing what the other controls. Trust isn't built by pretending danger doesn't exist. It's built by facing it honestly, together, and choosing not to use it against each other." Dravith's tapping fingers stilled, and for the first time, something like genuine consideration crossed his expression rather than simple suspicion. The negotiations continued for hours after that, moving through the specific language of the agreement, protections for human workers stationed across various systems, formal recognition ceremonies to be broadcast once the network returned, guarantees against future public humiliations of the kind that started this entire crisis. Nathan proved invaluable during this stretch, walking the representatives through the technical realities of the network with patience I hadn't expected from him, answering even hostile questions without a trace of irritation. It was during a brief recess, while attendants brought refreshments neither species could fully share, that trouble found us in a quieter, more dangerous form. I had stepped into the corridor outside the negotiation chamber to clear my head, and it was there that the officer from the throne room, the one who had demanded immediate retaliation against Earth, found me waiting near a darkened alcove. His name, I later learned, was Commander Yorick Vale, a decorated officer with a reputation for aggressive tactics that had served the Empire well in prior conflicts against less patient adversaries. "You think this ends here?" he said quietly, stepping close enough that I had to resist the urge to step back. "A few pretty words at a table, and suddenly your people walk away untouched, holding a blade over an empire 1,000 times your size. I think," I said carefully, "that your emperor understands the risk of doing anything else." Yorick's expression twisted into something bitter. "My emperor grows cautious with age. Others do not share his patience. There are fleets currently stationed near enough to Earth that a single order could see the matter settled permanently, before your precious failsafe has any chance to matter." My blood ran cold, though I forced my voice to remain level. "If you believe striking at Earth solves anything, you haven't been listening. The moment any hostile action reaches our homeworld, the second layer of the failsafe activates automatically, and unlike what happened today, it cannot be reversed by any negotiation, any apology, any change of heart afterward. Every ship in transit across this empire would lose its guidance the instant that failsafe triggers, including whatever fleet you're imagining might reach Earth in time to do anything at all. You expect me to believe a species that crawls through wiring for a living built something so absolute," Yorick said, though I noticed the confidence in his voice wavering slightly. "I expect you to consider the cost of being wrong," I said. "Because if you're right, and we're bluffing, you lose nothing by waiting a little longer for terms to be finalized. But if you're wrong, and we're not bluffing, you'll have doomed every ship your empire has in transit, across every system, permanently, over a single insult that never needed to happen in the first place." Yorick studied me for a long, tense moment, his jaw working slightly as he weighed something I couldn't see behind his eyes. Finally, without another word, he turned and walked away down the corridor, his footsteps echoing sharply against stone that no longer carried any hum of hidden machinery beneath it. I stood there for a moment, breathing carefully, before Nathan appeared beside me, having apparently followed a few steps behind without my noticing. "You heard that?" I said. "Enough of it," Nathan said grimly. "We need to warn the delegation inside. If there really are fleets close enough to reach Earth quickly, we need Corvain and the others to understand exactly what's at stake, before someone like Yorick decides to act without waiting for official permission." We returned to the negotiation chamber together, and I watched Grace's expression shift from calm focus to sharp concern as we quietly relayed what had happened in the corridor. Corvain Thess, to his credit, did not dismiss the warning. "I will speak with Fleet Command personally," he said, his voice tight with something that might have been genuine alarm. "No action will be taken against Earth while these negotiations remain active. I will make certain of it, and I will make certain Commander Vale understands the consequences of acting outside his authority." The rest of the session passed with a renewed sense of urgency, every representative around that table now keenly aware that the fragile peace being built in that room existed alongside a much more volatile reality unfolding somewhere beyond it, in fleets and command stations where patience was running thinner than any of us wished to admit. By the time we finally reached a provisional agreement, hours later, exhaustion had settled over every person at that table, human and alien alike. Grace signed the draft terms first, her hand steady despite the trembling I could see in her shoulders. Corvain signed next, followed by representatives from each of the worlds present, formal seals pressed carefully beside their names. It was not yet finished. The Emperor himself still needed to affirm these terms publicly, before witnesses, in a manner that could not later be quietly reversed or forgotten. But for the first time since the fire touched our flag, I allowed myself a small, cautious breath of something close to hope. Nathan caught my eye across the table, and though neither of us smiled, I saw in his expression the same fragile relief I felt settling slowly into my own chest. "One more step," he murmured. "Just one more, and then we find out if any of this actually holds." Outside the chamber, somewhere far above the station, the dark network waited patiently, still silent, still listening, ready to answer whatever choice the Empire made next. The Great Hall looked different the second time I stood in it. The golden brazier where our flag had burned still sat at the center of the platform, cold now, its ashes swept away sometime during the long hours we had spent negotiating in that quieter, lantern-lit chamber. The camera drones that had dropped from the air during the blackout hung suspended once more, though none of them carried any light yet, waiting, like everyone else in that hall, for permission to come back to life. Every representative from the negotiation session stood arranged along the platform now, Corvain Thess near the front with the formal document rolled carefully beneath his arm, Ilsa Bracken and Dravith Kaur a short distance behind him, their expressions unreadable but attentive. Grace Whitfield stood beside me, her posture perfectly composed despite the exhaustion I knew she carried from the hours before. Nathan Cole stood on my other side, close enough that I could feel the tension radiating from him, tightly controlled but present all the same. We had been told the Emperor would speak once, publicly, before the assembled court, and whatever representatives from allied worlds could be gathered on short notice. Whether he would honor the terms fully, or attempt some final act of pride before conceding, none of us knew for certain, and the uncertainty sat heavy in my chest as the great doors at the far end of the hall finally opened. The Emperor entered without the usual procession of drones and fanfare that had marked every prior appearance I'd witnessed. He walked alone, flanked only by two silent guards, his violet eyes moving slowly across the gathered crowd, before settling, briefly, on our small human delegation standing near the platform's edge. He climbed the steps to his throne but did not sit. Instead, he stood before it, facing the crowd directly, the cold brazier at his feet, the dead screen behind him still dark, waiting. 3 days ago, he began, his voice carrying through the silent hall without any hidden speaker to amplify it. I ordered an act meant to remind this empire, and every world beneath its banner, exactly where power resides. I believed that act would strengthen the throne. Instead, it revealed something I had not properly understood until this moment. Power, built on the constant humiliation of those who serve it, is not strength. It is a debt quietly accumulating, waiting for the day it finally comes due. A murmur moved through the crowd, quiet and uncertain, though nobody dared interrupt. For generations, the Emperor continued, this empire has depended on the labor of a people we considered too simple to matter, too small to deserve recognition beyond the basic function of their work. We were wrong, not because their work was more skilled than we assumed, though it was. We were wrong because respect is not something to be measured by usefulness alone, and a people who quietly hold an empire together deserve more than silence in return. I felt Nathan shift slightly beside me, and when I glanced at him, I saw something in his expression that looked almost like disbelief, as if he hadn't quite allowed himself to hope this moment would arrive so plainly. "Today," the Emperor said, "I formally recognize Earth as an equal partner within this empire, entitled to the same protections, the same considerations, and the same voice at this table as any other member world. This recognition is not a gift granted from generosity. It is a debt finally acknowledged, long overdue, and I make this acknowledgement before every world watching so that it cannot later be quietly forgotten." He gestured, and Corvain Thess stepped forward, unrolling the formal document and holding it aloft for the gathered crowd to see, before setting it upon a small stand beside the throne. "Let the terms be read into the Empire's permanent record," the Emperor said, "the moment our systems allow it. And let it be known that any future act of humiliation against a recognized member world, regardless of that world's size or the length of its history among the stars, will be treated as an offense against this throne itself." The hall remained silent for a long moment after he finished speaking, the weight of what had just been said settling slowly over everyone present. I watched several representatives exchange glances, some clearly surprised by the depth of the Emperor's concession, others nodding slowly, as if something long overdue had finally arrived. Commander Yorick Vale stood near the back of the gathered officers, his expression tight and unreadable, though I noticed he made no move to protest, no attempt to voice the aggression he had shown me in that quiet corridor. Whatever conversation Corvain had eventually had with Fleet Command, it seemed to have held. The Emperor turned then, toward Grace, toward Nathan, toward me, his violet eyes steady in a way that felt different from every previous time he had looked at us. "Commander Whitfield," he said, addressing Grace directly for the first time since our arrival, "on behalf of this throne, I ask that Earth's network be restored, and that this empire be given the chance to prove its acknowledgement was not merely words spoken under pressure." Grace stepped forward, her voice clear and steady as it carried across the silent hall. "Your Grace, we accept these terms, and we thank you for speaking them plainly before witnesses who will remember them." She paused, glancing briefly at Nathan, who gave the smallest possible nod. "The network will be restored immediately. I don't know exactly how the signal traveled, whether Nathan carried some device I never noticed, or whether the restoration had been prepared to trigger automatically the moment specific words were spoken publicly and recorded. I only know that within seconds of Grace finishing her sentence, the enormous screen behind the throne flickered once, then steadied into a soft, growing light. The camera drones hovering above the platform blinked back to life one by one, their small indicator lights glowing steady red once more. Across the hall I heard scattered gasps as personal devices carried by various officials chimed softly, reconnecting to networks that had been silent for the better part of a day. The screen behind the throne resolved into an image, not of the Emperor's face this time, but of something else entirely. A simple, steady image of Earth itself, blue and quiet, turning slowly against the backdrop of stars, with our flag, whole and uncharred, waving gently in an image captured from one of our own orbital stations. I felt something tighten in my throat as I watched it, a feeling too large and complicated to name cleanly, part grief for the flag that had burned, part fierce, quiet pride at seeing its true form displayed now across every screen the Empire still commanded. Nathan let out a slow breath beside me, and when I glanced at him I saw his eyes were bright, though his jaw remained steady. "They're broadcasting it," he murmured, "across every system, right now." I turned back to the screen, watching Earth continue its slow, patient turn against the stars, our flag rippling gently in an image that would soon be seen by 1,000 worlds that, until today, had barely known our world existed as anything more than a source of cheap labor. The Emperor remained standing before his throne, watching the same image, his expression unreadable but no longer carrying the cold certainty I had seen in him during the ceremony 3 days before. Whatever pride he still carried, it had been reshaped by the last several hours into something quieter, more cautious, perhaps even something close to respect, though I suspected it would take much longer than a single afternoon for that respect to feel entirely genuine, rather than simply necessary. Ilsa Bracken approached our delegation quietly once the formal proceedings began to wind down, her sharp eyes studying each of us in turn. "You could have taken so much more," she said again, echoing the same observation from our earlier negotiation. "And yet you asked only to be seen." "Being seen," I said, "is worth more than anything else we could have taken. Territory fades, resources get spent. Respect, once it's genuinely earned, tends to last considerably longer." She studied me a moment longer, then extended her hand in a gesture I recognized from human custom, one I hadn't expected an alien diplomat to know, let alone offer. Then I hope it lasts, she said, for both our sakes. I shook her hand, and something in that simple gesture felt like the first real proof that something fundamental had shifted, not just in policy, not just in formal documents rolled up and set aside for the historical record, but in the quiet, ordinary way people from entirely different worlds might choose to treat each other going forward. Later, once the formal ceremony ended and the crowd slowly dispersed, I found myself standing near the edge of the platform beside Nathan, both of us watching the last of the delegates filter out through the great doors. The screen behind the throne still played its slow, patient image of Earth, though the Emperor had finally taken his seat, watching it in a silence that felt, for the first time, genuinely reflective rather than merely tolerant. "You said something to me, back in that alcove," I said quietly, "about your grandmother, about the day someone in power would finally understand what this empire was built out of." Nathan nodded slowly, his eyes still on the screen. "She never got to see it. She passed years before any of this became necessary. But I think she'd recognize this moment, if she could see it. Not because we won anything through force, because we finally made them look." I thought about the flag burning 3 days ago, about the terrible, hollow feeling of watching something meaningful reduced to ash and smoke while an entire hall watched and did nothing. I thought about the silence that followed, sudden and absolute, and about everything that silence had ultimately made possible. "We didn't need to burn anything down," I said, almost to myself. "We just needed to remind them who built the house they've been living in." Nathan glanced at me, something like a genuine, tired smile finally breaking across his face. "And maybe," he said, "remind ourselves too, that we were never as small as they wanted us to believe." Outside the Great Hall, somewhere far above the station, the restored network hummed quietly back to life across 1,000 systems, carrying messages, guiding ships, connecting worlds that had spent one long, uncertain day discovering exactly how much they depended on people they had spent generations choosing not to see. On the screen behind the throne, Earth continued its slow, steady turn against the stars, our flag rippling gently in an image now shared with every world still watching, no longer a symbol burned for spectacle, but a quiet, patient reminder of exactly who we were, and exactly what we had built, long before anyone thought to ask. I stood there a while longer, watching that image turn, feeling the ache of the last 3 days finally begin to loosen its grip on my chest, replaced slowly by something steadier, something that felt, for the first time since we arrived on this station, very much like hope.